I'm from Iran, and I think it's very important that we don't try to make these countries into utopias because we want to talk about problems in this country. And I think we need to respect the fact that there are serious problems going on in Cuba, just like there are in Iran. And to say that Cuba is a democratic country, I think it really is doing a disservice to socialism. I think that when we talk about socialism and as a goal, and then we use Cuba as the model of socialism, I think we turn off a lot of people with legitimate concerns, which is that it's not a democracy. The fact that one man was running the country for so long is a serious problem. And to then equate that to socialism, degrade socialism into Cuba, and it shouldn't be like that. I mean, I don't think you have to be against socialism to criticize Cuba. I think, in fact, that, you know, Che Guevara himself had so much criticism of Castro and the way Castro was running the country at certain points. And I think that it's very important that we don't just become, you know, as Americans, take this utopic perspective of, oh, you know, I went to Cuba on a trip once, and when I was there, there was great. Well, of course, I mean, you saw that, but it doesn't do anything to belittle Cubans in Cuba who are suffering, just like it doesn't do anything to try to talk about Middle East intervention and say how horrible, you know, it is to have an imperialist war in the Middle East, and then in doing so, the next thing you say is, we have democracy in Iran, and look at America, how could you ever come into a country like Iran where we have true democracy? I mean, that's just not the truth. And you're taking such a nationalist perspective, and you're propping up a country, and you're putting down what true international and socialism should stand for, which is the voice of the people, which is why I support the comments made by the last gentleman here, which is we can't support the Cuban people and everything that they've done, but we don't have to support Fidel Castro and the repression that he's put down in the country. And we can't separate these things. And I just think it's very important that as socialists, we don't equate Cuba to socialism, because you turn off people for good reason, and for some of the reasons that this young lady's bringing up. And I just think it's important that we don't muddy the water and keep the conversation more practical and more realistic. I mean, Cuba's a country that has problems. Some of it is due to the embargo, but some of it is due to Fidel Castro. And maybe socialism and better forms of socialism are the answer, and capitalism surely isn't. But we need to explore socialism and what it can and can't do and how we can get to those roads. But let's not be stuck to Fidel Castro and make him a cult leader.
I would really challenge you that Cuba is not a democratic society. Cuba is probably one of the most democratic societies you will find anywhere. Fidel may be reelected as president, or his brother Raul recently, but he's elected by a National Assembly, which is elected on many, many levels. You know, somebody mentioned before, you could be 18 years old. And you should really study the electoral process of Cuba. In the special periods in 1993, 94, Cuba was having to deal with what do we do because of the blockade, because of the loss of social partners. People had discussions at every level, about how to deal with the problem. They didn't elect some billionaire senator and send him to Congress where that senator was supposed to somehow represent their economic interests. They met in every way that they could. Social justice, and the job, and schools, and community centers. We talked to people who had been at half a dozen different meetings where they all got to voice what they felt should be done to change conditions in Cuba. And those ideas were taken to the National Assembly, and they were discussed over a prolonged period of time. That's democracy. That's democracy. Let me finish. That's democracy. And you can say, well, maybe the embargo had some impact. Think about what it's like to live in a country where for almost 50 years you can't import oil. You can't import some basic necessities. You can't import. And if you trade with some country that's willing to bring these things to you, then that country can't trade with the U.S. That's what the embargo is. So Cuba's not a resource-rich country like Venezuela. They don't have the resources that some other Latin American countries. They were an agriculturally underdeveloped country that was the playground rich and famous from the U.S., you know, with the U.S.'s support of the Batista. They had a poverty level in Cuba before 1959 that would make Mississippi look good in 1959. The fourth state.
So basically, you're saying it ain't democratic, and you're saying it is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I challenge you.
Well,
I'm not saying about it.
I think it's actually a very interesting question, and it has to do with definition.
Class. It has to do with
It has
class.
to do with its definition of democracy.
Look, wait, before you just run over and characterize what I said, I didn't say if it is or if it isn't a democratic.
Good, okay.
Well, what I'm saying is that it has serious shortcomings and failings. And when we sit here in the United States and we criticize the fact that a father and son became president of the United States and run an entire country, we should also stop and question how two brothers ended up running an entire country. And I just think you take such a defensive posture when somebody criticizes of anything in Cuba, and that's the greatest disservice to do to Cubans, who are the founders and the people that keep the revolution alive. And it's just it doesn't do anybody any good to constantly try to support everything Fidel Castro did and Raul Castro did as utopic. It does nothing for the Cuban people.
We are not.
It doesn't do anything for
We're not
them.
suggesting that, but I think, you know, we live in a country where we can turn on the tap and have water. Most, not all of us, but a lot of us just take it for granted. It's always going to be, we waste it. We leave the water running. You know, we take it for granted that you can, if your car breaks down or your bike breaks down, you go and replace it or something, you know, even with the junker. That you go to the gas pump and you're able to get gas because now it's going up. We take those things for granted. Cuba doesn't have that luxury. They have had to make a lot of concessions to not having that luxury. We had to, if you took a shower when I was there, you put a bucket in there, you saved the water, you took that water, you flushed the toilet with it, and you anything that you had in the sink, you didn't throw the water away. Yeah, you saved the water because there was no immediate new source of water just because you turned the tap on. They didn't have the oil to man the electrical system to run the pumps to get the water. They don't have the same water resources that the U.S. is, and they could not import water because of the blockade. So yes, there are water shortages, but they did the best they could. They had people they had cisterns everywhere around to collect rainwater so that there would be at least another source of water. They were using windmill power where they could, so, you know, for powering things. They were trying to deal, solar power, they were trying to deal with a lot of the alternatives to what we take for granted because of the blockade.
But that's not what he's talking about.
But I'm saying a lot of the
but he's saying that it's more or less characterized by the personal dictatorship of Fidel and his brother. Okay, to some extent, okay, and that you do a disservice to Cuba by not being
Do a disservice to socialism and to Cubans by propping up Fidel Castro.
I'm kind of a moderate point. But I'll keep it short. But I mean, I agree fully with the sentiment that we should not make Cuba seem like this is the kind of socialism we need to put everywhere. Because every single nation that is going to have socialism is going to do it in a different way, with different shortcomings and different problems. There's always going to be problems with whatever system you have, especially after a revolution. It's a relatively young country when it comes to, it's having its own political system like this. I mean, it's 1959. The United States has been around for 200 years. But when we talk about the personal dictatorship of Fidel Castro, how unbelievable it is that a revolutionary leader like him could be elected with 90% of the vote, several concurrent times. George Washington had 100% of the vote, both times that he contended for the vote. And he was even offered the position of King of the United States. King of the United States, can we believe that? But we still get our knickers in a twist when we hear Fidel Castro gets reelected. At least there was an election. At least it's not hereditary. I mean, his brother was a revolutionary fighter. His brother had credentials that made him a viable leader for the country. I mean, there were other people that could have contended, sure, like Ricardo Alarcón, or there are a lot of people that could have contested that position, but it was Raul, because of his connection with Fidel, and because people identify him with his brother, that he was elected. I mean, he was elected in an open and fair contest. It's not like Iran. In Iran, you have an Ayatollah that can say whether or not the election's valid. In Cuba, there's no higher authority guy who sits around and says, I know, invalid today. I mean, it doesn't happen that way. It's an open democratic system with a very defined constitution and laws.
Who did Fidel run against?
Sorry?
Who did Fidel run
They
against?
have a parliamentary system.
Fidel